I first wish to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Tomajini people and their elders as the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work. Jane Austen's Adventurous Wives. Adventurous might not be the word that first springs to mind when you think of Jane Austen. Adventure and adventurous are not words that appear frequently in her work. In fact, when they are used, 6 times in the completed novels and more often in her private correspondence, the implied meaning is mostly that which modern readers would term misadventure. The meaning of adventurous has obviously changed over time. It is, firstly, a word that is associated with a certain amount of privilege. Financial freedom is required for adventure, and for women in the long 18th century, this was usually associated with marriage. Single, moneyed women could certainly be adventurous. Childlessness is also a prerequisite in this time period, or the money and inclination to have children cared for elsewhere. And it is, largely, a word associated with certain kinds of masculinity. I intend to use the word adventurous in this presentation as meaning willing to take risks or to try out new methods, ideas or experiences, as defined by Oxford Languages. The common perception is that Austen wrote quiet, domestic fiction that encapsulated and fulfilled the female reader's longing for romance. However, in her own time, her novels were not seen as romantic. The fact that they end with a marriage should not confuse us into thinking that these stories are romances. Marriage is, as Charlotte Lucas tells us in Pride and Prejudice, the only honourable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and, however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. When Austen takes time to describe a wife to us, that is, when the wife is not the closing image in the story, but rather a character in the novel, she is most often showing us a woman quite outside the expected romantic trope. There are, of course, conventional wives, usually taking little part in the narrative. Mrs. Morland, Mrs. Palmer, Lady Lucas, Mrs. Grant and others. But they are very much outnumbered by women who fit the definition of adventurous, who are willing to take risks, who try new ideas and methods of being a wife and a woman in a society that very much tried to enclose married and single women in a straitjacket of moral and social regulation. Austen's wives show us more possibilities in the future of her heroines than might be expected. Charlotte Lucas and Mrs. Gardiner in Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, and Mrs. Croft in Persuasion all fall outside the expected 18th century domestic ideal of the proper wife. Charlotte Lucas is, perhaps, the most modern woman Austen wrote, with her single-minded determination to decide and design her own future. Charlotte is really extraordinary and is perhaps my favourite Austen character. She has, unlike most of Austen's other women, a clear picture of herself and her preferred future. She is, she tells us herself, not romantic, and neither is she idealistic. She knows a lot about men and marriage, without thinking highly of either, and has obviously given it considerable thought. She can see and articulate what is happening with Jane Bennet and Mr. Bingley, and she can advise on the best method for Jane's securing the match. It is a method we can be sure she would use herself, because she is viewing marriage as a preservative from want, rather than a romantic meeting of minds and feelings. It is not just that Charlotte is unromantic in a way that Elizabeth and Jane Bennet find completely alien. It is that she has the courage of her convictions and a sureness to her actions that neither of the main characters ever attain. Charlotte marries without love, admiration, or even the vaguest respect for her husband. And surely, if we are meant as readers to disapprove of this, Charlotte would receive a punishment in kind for her mercenary decisions. In a romantic novel, Charlotte's pursuit of marriage without love would receive appropriate retribution, but it does not. She gets exactly what she wants, and she is happy with it. She has an establishment, the respect of those around her, a position in society, and a secure future with the inheritance of Longbourn to fall to her husband in due course. And because she has chosen coolly and with an eye only for her own comfort, she has a weak man for a husband, a man she can manage and manipulate into being as small a part of her married life as practicable. Austen positively rewards Charlotte Lucas for being unromantic and practical. Charlotte is adventurous as a single woman when she ambushes Mr. Collins into marriage, but she continues to be adventurous as a wife, using methods that have never occurred to the more conventional heroine to obtain what she wants and needs from her own existence. Charlotte is unapologetically modern. She assesses her situation, posits solutions, and goes after the most achievable one with determination and bravery, and she is rewarded with a comfortable life and a bright future. More minor characters include, in the same novel, Mrs. Gardner, who is obviously an equal partner in her marriage and not confined to the care of her house and children. She has adventures while travelling and is happy to assert her right in equal consideration in decisions. Mrs. John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility is another assertive wife. In one of the funniest and most subversive scenes in Austen's work, she manages to manipulate her husband into completely reversing his firm decision to financially support his stepmother and half-sisters. They will have no carriage, no horses, and hardly any servants. They will keep no company and can have no expenses of any kind. Only conceive how comfortable they will be. 500 a year! I'm sure I cannot imagine how they will spend half of it. And as to your giving them more, it is quite absurd to think of it. They will be much more able to give you something. She even gets him to agree that the china service her mother-in-law will inherit should really belong to the house that they will occupy. She is a masterpiece of characterisation, a woman who has aspirations and no hesitation in pursuing them. Then, and perhaps the most obvious adventurous Austen wife, there is Mrs. Croft in Persuasion, who has travelled the world on navy ships with her husband and is much more than the reputation as a very pretty girl that her future husband heard. She is the unacknowledged manager of the Croft household and relationship, just as she quietly manages her husband's carriage driving. But by coolly giving the reins a better direction herself, they happily passed the danger, and by once afterwards judiciously putting out her hand, they neither fell into a rut nor ran foul of a dung cart. Even Emma Woodhouse's sister, Mrs. John Knightley, is much more adventurous, albeit under the safe supervision of her husband, than the eponymous heroine herself, and more widely travelled and experienced than Emma may ever be. These women are adventurous while their husbands are alive, but Austen's widows are also braver than society might expect of them. Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility packs up her scant possessions and relocates her unprotected female family halfway across England, all alone, having sent her few servants ahead of her. Shrewd, observant, perspicacious, Mrs. Jennings is very much the driving force in the narrative of this novel, a female powerhouse, fiercely deciding and dispensing matrimonial possibilities, largesse and advice. In the same novel, Mrs. Ferris takes control of her finances and her sons in a most assertive and theoretically unfeminine way. She is taking a risk in managing her family in this tyrannical pseudo-masculine way, but there is no evidence in the novel that she finds the outcomes unsatisfactory or sees any reason to change her methods. And then there are the more irregularly adventurous wives. Can we consider Maria Rushworth in Mansfield Park adventurous? She is certainly willing to take a risk for new experiences. She marries a man she despises in order to obtain freedom away from her father's close supervision. She risks everything and loses in order to have an extramarital affair, certainly not conventional behaviour for an 18th century wife. Her adventurousness is punished, but that does not detract from the fact that she was willing to take the risk. Lydia Bennet, who becomes Lydia Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, is another sexually adventurous woman. There is no reason to assume from the text that her conduct is curbed by her marriage, rather that her marriage gives her licence to continue her outrageous behaviour. Austen tells us that even when she eventually becomes disenchanted with her husband, she retained all the claims to reputation which her marriage had given her. Mrs. Clay in Persuasion is another woman willing to take sexual risks to secure her future. We hear of her first as a woman who has returned after an unprosperous marriage to her father's house with the additional burden of 2 children. That phrase, unprosperous marriage, is a fascinating one. Although we find out much later in the novel that in fact Mrs. Clay is a widow, the astute reader can wonder for those intervening chapters exactly what Mrs. Clay's status is and what made her marriage so unprosperous. Like Maria Rushworth, Mrs. Clay throws her reputation and position in society away for an illicit sexual liaison with Mr. Elliot. Perhaps she does not have quite so much to lose as Maria, but she is taking the bigger risk as she has no wealthy family as a safety net if things go wrong. It is worth noting that these women, as well as the accomplished vulgarian Mary Crawford, were convincingly written by the allegedly well-behaved, conservative and very unadventurous gentlewoman Jane Austen. It can be difficult to see from these examples what Austen the novelist actually thought of marriage. Whilst it is the conclusion for all her heroines, it is not necessarily an absolutely happy one. Modern preconceptions of Austen as a romance writer and modern adaptations of her work for film and television allow recent readers to overlook the aspects of Austen's novels that are distinctly unromantic. The filmic focus on the happy endings of the novels allows little room for adventurous wives in the narratives when, it seems, all the stories end in the coupling, for better or worse, of a young woman with an older, more experienced and well-off man. It is difficult to imagine Henry Tilney's young wife or the new Mrs. Darcy behaving in an adventurous manner, much less Emma Woodhouse, who will be under the watchful supervision of 2 much older men once she marries. However, Austen's treatment of the women who are not central characters is always interesting and potentially enlightening if we read the text closely. There are few happy functional marriages in her novels, and those that appear happiest have a strong female partner. Mrs. Gardiner and Mrs. Croft both appear to have successful marriages. Mrs. Weston in Emma seems to manage her husband and her marriage in a way that mirrors her managing of Emma herself as a child. The Harvilles in Persuasion appear to have an equitable and harmonious relationship, predicated on her good-humoured and sensible management of their limited resources. Austen wrote many women, and men as well, who fit into our modern idea of gender roles in the long 18th century. But she also wrote realistic individuals who demonstrate that across history, performances of gender have never been as simplistic as they appear in retrospect. There is, of course, the pallid, misogynist argument that these women are just using feminine wiles to get their own way. I will leave aside the rage this kind of thinking arouses in me. I mean, really? We have to use trickery to get our needs met. And why would that be? But what is adventurous about Austen's women is the identifying and prioritising of their own needs. This is something that is extremely difficult for women even in the 21st century. For women of the long 18th century, the idea that what they wanted was important and worth pursuing was a radical and risky one. Fanny Dashwood is ensuring that her son inherits as much as possible, and perhaps that is understandable enough, but her own greed and her need for status are in there too, and her cleverness in persuading her lord and master, without ever seeming to actually be against his position, is a wonderful thing to behold. Mrs. Ferris is a controlling mother, a common enough trope of the older woman, but she is effectively enforcing her own will on adult men. Maria Rushworth, Lydia Wickham and Mrs. Clay all put their own sexual and emotional needs ahead of everything else, absolutely everything else that their society values in women. These minor characters in Austen's work show a wide range of possibilities for women whose behaviour is not bounded by the rules of a patriarchal society. Her adventurous wives challenge the sometimes romantic preconceptions and muddled thinking of many of her heroines.